All right, so you're jumping back into Silent Hill with this remake, huh? A whole stack of reviews just came out. GameRant, GameSpot, even GamePressure, and you want to see if it lives up to, well, everything.
Yeah, especially with Silent Hill 2. That game wasn't just a game, it was an experience. And a lot of reviewers are saying this remake is super faithful, but will that work in 2024? That's the question.
Good point. Okay, so first impressions, the atmosphere. Every single review, I don't care what else they say, agrees on one thing. This game is straight up terrifying. Not like jump scare terrifying, though, right?
Right, from what I'm seeing, it sounds like they really understood that Silent Hill 2 is about psychological horror. Like they used binaural audio for the sound design.
Binaural audio.
Yeah, so it's like the sound is engineered to be super realistic, surrounds you.
Yeah.
Imagine hearing whispers, radio static, all that creepy stuff, but it's like right next to your ear.
Oh, God, no thank you.
Yeah, and the fog isn't just for looks anymore either, not just to hide outdated graphics.
Right,
It
right.
actually limits your field of vision, like forces you to get up close and personal with whatever's out there. Combine that with the score by Akira Yamaoka, the composer from the original, and yeah, it sounds like a recipe for some serious nightmares.
Speaking of nightmares, GameSpot actually compared the overall vibe to a David Lynch film. Like, dreamlike, but super disturbing. Which, honestly, that's Silent Hill 2 in a nutshell, isn't it? That whole messing with your perception of reality thing.
100%. And it sounds like the remake really leans into that. IGN mentioned how the game uses darkness, like your flashlight has a super limited range, so you're constantly plunged into darkness, can't see what's ahead.
Classic horror movie trope.
Exactly. And super effective here, apparently.
Okay, so we've established that the atmosphere is on point. Which, let's be real, crucial for a Silent Hill game. But atmosphere alone does not a good game make. How's the gameplay?
That's where things get interesting. Let's talk about the combat first, because the original was, well, notoriously clunky. Reviewers seem a bit torn on if this one's any better.
Yeah, I was reading that GameRant actually thought the clunky combat added to the fear. You know, that whole survival horror thing where every bullet counts?
Which makes sense. They kept that emphasis on limited resources, strategic decision-making. You can't just run in guns blazing here.
But on the other hand, Eurogamer was like, who wants to go back to that after playing more modern games with fluid controls?
Yeah, and it's a valid point. Remaking a game from 2001, you have to find that balance between staying true to the original and, well, not alienating an entire generation of gamers who weren't even born yet.
Right, right. So what did they do?
It sounds like they tried to find a middle ground.
Mm-hmm.
They've got this new dodge mechanic, IGN mentioned that specifically, and GamePressure even compared the combat to the Callisto Protocol, like more about timing your dodges, making your shots count.
Interesting. Sounds more deliberate than just button mashing, at least.
Okay, so combat check. Still a bit of a sticking point, potentially. But what about the puzzles? Did Bloober Team go all out with those two? Oh, absolutely. GamesRadar said you could take every puzzle from the recent Resident Evil remakes, combine them, and you still wouldn't have as many as this Silent Hill 2 remake.
That's a lot of puzzles.
Yeah.
Okay, but are they any good? All right, so we've made it through the fog of combat and puzzles, but there's another layer to this remake we got to talk about. The visuals. This ain't your PlayStation 2 Silent Hill anymore.
Definitely not. We're talking complete visual overhaul. And actually, GamePressure made a good point in the original. That fog, it was often hiding the tech limitations. Now it's like a deliberate artistic choice.
Yeah.
Adds to the whole atmosphere of dread.
Makes sense. And from what I'm seeing, they definitely leaned into the creepy factor. Reviewers are using words like visually stunning, dripping with detail to describe the environments.
And importantly, it sounds like they knew that the horror should be in the details. Like, GameRant was praising the facial animations, saying they add this whole other level of depth to the characters. Apparently, the characters often look dazed, lost in thought, like Silent Hill's got hold of them.
Ooh, unsettling. Eurogamer said something similar, like it gives the characters this almost dreamlike quality, like they know something's wrong, but they can't quite grasp it.
Exactly. Plays into that psychological horror we were talking about, the unease, that constant questioning of what's real.
Speaking of questioning what's real, we got to talk about those Silent Hill 2 monster designs. They were already nightmare fuel in the original. What'd they do with those?
Let's just say they cranked up the nightmare fuel. Reviewers are saying those creatures, the lying figures, the nurses, even Pyramid Head, they've all been recreated in, like, excruciating detail.
Okay, hold on. For those who maybe missed the original, what are these lying figures? What makes them so creepy?
So picture this. Contorted, fleshy figures, almost like living mannequins, all wrapped in bandages, moving in these jerky, unnatural ways. And they represent, like, repressed guilt, trauma, Big themes in Silent Hill, too.
Yeah, not something you want to run into in a dark alley.
Ugh.
Or anywhere, really.
Nope. And GameSpot specifically called out Pyramid Head, said his, like, jagged head, that dark, oily stuff all over him, even more menacing now. It's crazy how visual details can amp up the fear factor.
It's a thin line, though, right? Between visually impressive and just plain disturbing.
For sure. And it sounds like not every design choice was a home run. GamesRadar thought some creatures, like the lying figures and nurses, were actually creepier in the original. More left to the imagination, you know?
Totally. Sometimes what you don't see is way scarier than anything a developer could dream up. Which kind of brings us back to that whole tension in this remake between staying true to the original and updating it for today's players.
100%. And nowhere is that tension more obvious than in the story and the dialogue. Because they didn't just, like, polish up the graphics. They made some actual changes to the story.
Really? Okay, I gotta know, are we talking just a few lines here and there or like significant plot changes?
It's a mix from what I've read. Some lines are straight from the original, some have been tweaked, and there are even whole new scenes added in.
Wow, okay, big swings. So what's the verdict? Did these changes work? Did they make the story better?
Well, that's where it gets interesting. Opinions are kind of all over the place. You've got sites like Eurogamer. They're praising the changes, saying it adds new layers to the story without ruining the original feel. They even like that they expanded the backstory for some characters.
But then you've got GamePressure saying the changes were pointless, that they took away some of the mystery that made the original so good.
Exactly. And then there's Maria, right, who's, well, she's a whole complicated character in James's story. And she's been at the center of the debate about this remake being faithful or not.
Right, Maria. That whole duality thing she's got going on. GameSpot even said her redesign is like the most noticeable example of them modernizing the game.
Yeah, and that's where it gets tricky. Because it's not just about changing how a character looks, it's about what those changes mean. GamesRadar pointed out that she's way less sexualized in this version. And given, how we think about female characters' representation, it makes sense they do that.
It does, yeah. But it also brings up those questions of artistic intent, right? Does changing those parts, even if it's with good intentions, change the story that Silent Hill 2 was trying to tell?
Big questions, man. No easy answers. It's really up to each player to decide how they feel about those changes and if they work for them.
All right, so we've covered the atmosphere, the combat, the puzzles, even the redesigns and those story changes. Sounds like Bloober Team took some risks with this one. But is it enough to say, hey, go book a ticket back to Silent Hill? What's the bottom line?
Well, before we make the final call, there's one more thing. The game's length. And this is another thing reviewers are divided on.
So we've got this crazy atmospheric remake, stunning visuals, some iffy combat, puzzles galore. But now you're telling me they messed with the length, too. For a game that's all about tension, that feels risky.
It really does. And yeah, the reviews seem to reflect that. Eurogamer, I think it was, they said this remake is almost twice as long as the original.
Twice? Wow, okay. We're talking a lot more game here. What's the deal with that? Did they just add a bunch of new stuff, or is it, like, stretched out?
That seems to be the big question.
Yeah.
IGN finished it in about 15 hours compared to the original's 8. And GamesRadar 2 felt like some of that extra time was just filler, especially early on. They even said the pacing dragged a bit at the end, too many puzzles, not enough breathing room.
Interesting. Because that goes back to what we were saying about the puzzles, right? Like, Bloober Team really went for it with those, but I can see how it could be overkill. Even for puzzle people.
Totally. It's a balance, and it sounds like maybe, just maybe, they didn't quite nail it this time. Although, to be fair, some reviewers who loved the original puzzles, they didn't mind the extra playtime at all.
So it's all about what you're looking for in your Silent Hill 2 experience, I guess. You want that tight, focused psychological horror. This might not be it, but more time with the characters, the world, the puzzles. Maybe you'll love the extra hours.
Exactly. Know what you're getting into.
Yeah.
This isn't just a fresh coat of paint. It's a whole reimagining in some ways. Speaking of which, we've talked a lot about the changes they made, but there's stuff they kept the same too, right?
Oh, for sure. A lot of reviewers give them props for keeping the main story, the characters, all that, true to the original. And GameSpot was really happy about the quality of life stuff. They mentioned the map's way better now, and no more fixed camera angles, which, let's be real, those haven't aged well.
Makes sense. Those kinds of improvements, they make the game better for new players without ruining what made it special in the first place.
It's a tough thing to get right. So after all this digging, all these reviews, what's the final word? Should people go back to Silent Hill or stay far, far away from the fog?
Honestly. There's no easy answer. The reviews are everywhere, from pretty good to masterpiece. It's wild. Depends what each reviewer cared about most. GameSpot, for example, they loved the atmosphere, the psychological stuff, gave it a 9 out of 10. But GamePressure, they weren't into the pacing, some of the changes, gave it like a 6.5.
So what's a Silent Hill fan to do?
Think about what you liked about Silent Hill 2 back in the day. Was it the atmosphere, the story, the puzzles, the combat even? This remake's got strengths and weaknesses.
Gotta figure out what matters most to you.
Exactly. And maybe, just maybe, ask yourself, does a remake, even one with problems, make the original worse? Or can it be a new way to appreciate a classic?
Now, those are some questions worth thinking about. You've given us a lot to chew on today.
Just like a good trip into Silent Hill should.